On a cold October morning in 1415, the proud flower of French chivalry gathered before a narrow, rain-soaked field between two forests near Agincourt. Across that mire stood a ragged band of Englishmen, hollow-eyed, starving, and caked in filth, clutching longbows that had once humbled Europe's mightiest knights. The French commanders looked upon them and laughed. 6,000 half-dead peasants could never stand against 25,000 nobles armored in steel and pride. And yet, as they lowered their visors and prepared to charge, history was already repeating itself. Because 70 years earlier their grandfathers had done this exact thing. At Crécy, thousands of French knights had drowned in the same kind of mud, under the same black rain of English arrows. Chroniclers had written entire books about it. Veterans had warned their sons never to charge archers on soft ground. Priests had preached it from pulpits, that God himself had punished French arrogance that day. But memory fades faster than pride, and chivalry was a stubborn religion. Now the descendants of those slain lords were about to reenact their ancestors' catastrophe, only worse. The ground was heavier, the space narrower, and the enemy even more desperate. The very same mistake, repeated not out of ignorance, but devotion, a ritual sacrifice to honor long-dead forebears. As dawn broke on October 25th, the French nobility rode forward once more, banners streaming, hearts blazing with confidence, and boots sinking into the same cursed mud that had already buried their past. They had 70 years to learn. And they learned nothing. The Battle of Agincourt should never have happened. By every law of strategy, by every rule of common sense, the English army should have been wiped out long before it ever saw the French lines. When King Henry V invaded France in the summer of 1415, he brought with him the confidence of a young monarch hungry for glory, and barely 12,000 men. His plan was simple: capture a port, secure a foothold, and remind France that England still claimed her crown. But wars are never as clean as plans on parchment. The campaign began with the siege of Harfleur, a 5-week nightmare of disease, dysentery, and attrition. The walls fell, yes, but victory came at a terrible cost. Thousands of English soldiers rotted in the trenches or died choking on their own blood. By the time the gates opened, Henry's army had been cut in half. He should have gone home. Winter was closing in. His men were sick, starving, and barefoot. But retreat would mean humiliation, and Henry wasn't about to return to London as a failure. So he made a gamble that would define him forever. He decided to march his weakened army overland to Calais, the English stronghold on the coast. It was supposed to take 8 days. Instead, it became a death march through the heart of enemy territory. The French knew exactly where he was. Scouts shadowed every movement, cutting bridges, flooding fords, and burning villages ahead of him. Each day forced the English deeper inland into colder rain and thicker mud. The soldiers called it the bloody flux, a plague of dysentery that left them doubled over, bleeding and delirious. Men could barely stand, let alone march. Contemporary accounts are horrifying. English bowmen too sick to wear trousers, fighting with their legs bare because the stench of their own clothing made them gag. Horses collapsing mid-step, wagons sinking to their axles. Entire units fell behind and simply disappeared. By the time Henry reached the Somme River, his army was no longer an army. It was a procession of corpses still walking, and yet he refused to turn back. Henry believed that God was testing him, the way he tested kings of old. Every river that blocked his path, every bridge burned before him was a trial of faith. And so he pressed on, dragging his army northward, closer to Calais, and straight into the jaws of the French host assembling to destroy him. By late October, the French had gathered a force of at least 25,000 men. Nobles, knights, crossbowmen, a glittering wall of armor stretching across the countryside. They knew Henry was cornered. The English were half-starved, outnumbered 4-1, and far from home. To the French commanders, this wasn't a battle. It was a harvest, a chance to ransom English lords, capture a king, and restore the honor lost by their grandfathers at Crécy. The night before the confrontation, the contrast between the two camps could not have been starker. On one side, the French nobility feasted on wine and roasted meats, gambling over who would claim Henry's jeweled crown. Some even had cages built in advance for their expected prisoners. They toasted to easy glory, confident that dawn would bring victory. Across the muddy field, the English camp was silent. No laughter, no songs, only the groans of dying men and the murmured prayers of those preparing to follow them. Priests moved between tents hearing confessions by candlelight. Some soldiers wrote final letters to wives and children, knowing they'd never deliver them. Henry walked among his men that night, speaking little, his armor dulled by weeks of rain. He ordered total silence. Any man who made a sound risked losing an ear. He didn't want the French to hear how weak his army truly was. Across the field, the glow of French campfires flickered through the mist, a cruel reminder of how unequal this fight would be. By dawn, the English were trapped between two forests, penned into a narrow corridor of mud that reeked of rot and rain. To their front lay a killing ground, 1,000 yards wide at most, bordered by thick woods on either side. There would be no flanking maneuvers, no cavalry sweeps, no elegant strategies. Just a straight line of men who would either hold or die where they stood. For the French, it looked like destiny. They would erase the shame of Crécy here on this field, 70 years after their ancestors' humiliation. What they didn't realize was that destiny was waiting too, patient, merciless, and ready to punish arrogance once again. But the worst was still ahead, and that was only the beginning. At dawn on October 25th, 1415, the Feast of Saint-Cyr, Crispin, the fate of two kingdoms hung on a patch of sodden farmland. The French commanders gathered in their pavilion, the canvas walls glowing gold in the firelight, steam rising from their armor. There was no fear, only impatience. The English were cornered like animals. All that remained was to decide how to divide the spoils. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, stood at the head of the council, parchment maps spread before him, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. The plan was simple: advance, crush the English line, and end the campaign in a single glorious charge. To his left, Marshal Boucicaut, one of the few men who had studied the disasters of Crécy and Poitiers, protested. The ground was too soft, the English longbowmen too dangerous. They should use their crossbowmen first or wait until the English, weak from hunger, were forced to attack. But the hall erupted with laughter. Wait, one duke sneered. Wait for peasants to decide when French knights fight? Others mocked Boucicaut openly. Caution was cowardice. Honor demanded action. It was the same chorus their grandfathers had sung at Crécy, and it would end the same way. When Boucicaut suggested deploying the Genoese crossbowmen to soften the English lines, another noble barked, "Do you mean to let merchants begin the battle while knights stand idle?" The phrase hung in the air like a curse. French pride would not permit strategy to interfere with spectacle. The crossbowmen were pushed to the rear, their weapons useless. Outside, the ranks of French nobility assembled in glittering rows, armor polished, crests shining, banners snapping in the wind. The sight was breathtaking. It was also suicidal. The field of Agincourt had been freshly plowed before the rains. Thick, clay-rich soil that clung to boots and hooves like glue. The English position sat at the narrowest point between the two forests, their flanks anchored by sharpened stakes angled toward the enemy. A new defense borrowed from years of bitter lessons. To the French, the sight of those defenses should have screamed danger. Instead, they saw insult. The greatest nobles of France, dukes, counts, and barons, would not be held back by sticks and mud. Behind the front ranks, the 2nd and 3rd French divisions waited, shoulder to shoulder, packed so tightly that movement was almost impossible. It was a formation born not from tactics but from pride. They believed numbers alone could crush any resistance. They believed courage could overcome physics. Meanwhile, the English lines remained eerily still. No war drums, no horns, just silence and the whisper of wind over wet fields. The longbowmen stood in ragged ranks, their legs bare, their faces drawn and pale. They were too weak to shout, too sick to tremble. And yet, every man there knew his task: to stand, to shoot, and to die if needed. Henry moved among them, wearing his crown over his helmet, so all would see where their king stood. He had no reserves, no escape, but he had something the French lacked: unity born of desperation. The French, on the other hand, had everything except discipline. Their confidence had curdled into arrogance. Some knights were still arguing about ransom shares minutes before the signal to advance. Others bragged about how quickly the English archers would scatter once they saw mounted nobles bearing down on them. When the horns finally sounded, the first movement of the day came not from the English but from the French cavalry. Two wings of mounted knights, perhaps 200 in total, surged forward on either flank, their mission to sweep the archers aside. It began with thunder. Hooves striking mud, armor clanking, lances gleaming in the gray light. But within moments that thunder dulled to a sickening slurp. The horses sank up to their knees. The charge slowed. The open field had turned to quicksand. From the English lines, the archers raised their bows, yew wood polished smooth from years of use, and began to shoot. Not a scattered volley, but a storm. Thousands of arrows rose, hissed through the rain, and fell with a sound like tearing cloth. The first ranks of cavalry collapsed instantly. Horses screamed as shafts pierced their chests. Riders toppled, trampled by their own companions. Some mounts, driven mad with pain, bolted back into the advancing infantry, throwing the French columns into chaos before the battle had truly begun. A few knights reached the English line, only to find rows of sharpened stakes waiting. Horses impaled themselves, pitching their riders into the mud where archers finished them with mallets and knives. Within minutes, both cavalry wings were gone, destroyed by a weapon the French had spent 70 years failing to understand. The survivors who staggered back brought more than fear. They brought disorder. The advancing infantry now had to climb over fallen horses and wounded comrades, breaking formation before they had even reached the enemy. And yet, the French kept coming. They had to. Behind them, tens of thousands of men were pressing forward, the sheer weight of bodies forcing the front ranks onward. By 11 a.m., the main advance began. A solid wall of steel and flesh moving slowly, painfully through the sucking mud. Each man carried 60 pounds of armor, sinking deeper with every step. Helmets filled with sweat, breath turned to steam. What had begun as a march became a crawl. The finest army in France reduced to stumbling figures in a swamp. Still, they pushed forward, banners dragging in the muck, hearts pounding under iron plates. They believed their courage would carry them through. They didn't realize the mud itself had already chosen sides. The French advance began not with glory, but with suffocation. Thousands of armored men trudged forward into a quagmire that swallowed every step. The ground had been soaked by days of autumn rain, and as the first ranks pressed ahead, the field turned to liquid earth. Horses thrashed, men slipped, and the polished brilliance of French armor vanished under layers of mud. Each movement became agony. The weight of steel that once symbolized nobility now became an anchor. Men couldn't lift their legs without tearing them free from the suction beneath. Soldiers fell and were unable to rise again, pinned by their own armor as comrades stumbled over them. The entire vanguard became a heaving mass of bodies trapped by their own momentum. From the English line, it looked less like an army and more like a tide struggling to reach the shore. The longbowmen, some barefoot, some half-naked in tattered linen, stood behind their sharpened stakes, drawing and loosing in rhythmic silence. They didn't need to aim precisely. The sky itself did the killing. Arrows arced high into the gray air and fell like rain, iron-tipped, heavy, relentless. Each volley ripped through visors, pierced neck joints, or lodged deep into shoulders and thighs. A single shaft might not kill, but it broke the rhythm of the advance. One stumble became 2, then 10, then hundreds. Within minutes, the French line slowed to a crawl. Yet pride refused to yield. The nobles bellowed for the men to press on, convinced that once they reached the English stakes, victory would come in a single sweep. But the closer they got, the worse it became. The field funneled them tighter, compressing the French army into a human bottleneck. Those in the rear couldn't see the slaughter ahead. They only knew they were being shoved forward. Each step crushed the fallen deeper into the mud. Every death made the ground slicker, heavier, and more impossible to cross. Eyewitnesses later wrote that the noise was unbearable, a deafening blend of metal on metal, screams, and the wet, sucking sounds of men drowning where they stood. The first French knights reached the English front line just before midday. Exhausted, gasping, their armor caked in mud, they had marched nearly half a mile through hell, and by the time they reached their enemy, they were too spent to fight. The English archers dropped their bows and grabbed the weapons they'd prepared for this moment: hammers, axes, and knives. The longbowmen surged forward from behind their stakes and fell upon the disoriented French like wolves. They weren't knights. They weren't trained in courtly duels. They were butchers. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a collapse. The French vanguard, crushed from behind by its own reinforcements, had no room to swing swords or even raise shields. Men were jammed shoulder to shoulder so tightly that when one fell, he dragged 3 more down with him. The press was so dense that knights suffocated inside their armor, standing upright, unable to move or breathe. The mud did the rest. As the fighting dragged on, the churned earth became a graveyard. Corpses formed barriers. The weight of the 2nd Division pushed even more soldiers into the killing ground. Every few feet, a mound of bodies marked where an entire banner had fallen. Henry himself fought on foot in the front ranks, a king reduced to the same filth as his men. At one point, a French knight swung a battle axe that split part of Henry's crown clean off his helmet. But the English king refused to fall. He fought on, surrounded by his guard, his presence turning panic into stubborn defiance. Behind him, the longbowmen pressed closer, hacking through armor with short blades. They stripped the fallen for anything useful: daggers, axes, arrows. The air was thick with steam, blood, and the metallic tang of rain-soaked iron. Then came the 2nd French wave. Tens of thousands more knights, furious at the slaughter of their comrades, surged forward into the same killing field. But the bodies of the 1st Division blocked their way. Horses stumbled over corpses. Riders fell face first into pools of mud and couldn't rise again. What had begun as orderly ranks dissolved into chaos, an avalanche of men and metal crushing itself. Those in the back tried to retreat, but it was too late. The press was unstoppable. Every breath became a struggle. Men tore at their helmets, clawing for air, only to be trampled by the next line behind them. By early afternoon, the ground between the 2 armies was no longer a field at all. It was a living nightmare, a lake of blood and mud where sound itself seemed to drown. Still, the French refused to break. They fought not for victory anymore, but for pride. Each knight believed that if he could just reach the king, if he could just strike one blow, the tide might turn. But there was no tide left, only drowning men. When Henry saw that the 2nd Division had met the same fate as the 1st, he ordered his archers to drag the wounded back behind the line. The prisoners were too many to guard, the field too unstable to hold. Every decision was made in the chaos of survival. As the sun began to set behind the gray clouds, the cries of the dying merged into a single, endless moan, the sound of France's chivalry sinking beneath its own weight. By mid-afternoon, the field of Agincourt was no longer a battlefield. It was a swamp of corpses. The once golden banners of France lay trampled in the mud, indistinguishable from the bodies beneath them. Armor glinted faintly in the gray light, as the rain returned, soft at first, then heavier, washing streaks of blood into the ruts carved by thousands of boots and hooves. King Henry stood among the wreckage, motionless, his face hidden beneath his dented helmet. Around him, the groans of the dying mixed with the low murmur of English voices counting prisoners and collecting the fallen. It was not celebration. It was exhaustion, the kind that seeps into bone. By all accounts, Henry's men could barely stand. Their bows were warped from the rain, their quivers empty. The archers had fought with knives for hours, their hands blistered raw. The knights, who still lived, were covered in dents and cuts, their armor black with grime. And yet, against every law of numbers, they had done it. They had survived. What stood before them was the annihilation of France's nobility, the core of its knightly class. Hundreds of its greatest names lay dead or drowning in mud. The Constable of France, the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Bar, and scores of others whose families had shaped the kingdom for generations. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. As Henry surveyed the horizon, scouts brought grim news. A fresh French force was approaching. Not another full army, but enough men to threaten the exhausted English line. Hundreds of horsemen and local levies were gathering to strike what they thought was a retreating foe. Henry looked at the prisoners, thousands of them. Many were highborn, worth fortunes in ransom, but if they rose up or were rescued, the English line would be overwhelmed in minutes. He had no men to spare for guards, no energy for mercy. So he made a decision that would stain his reputation forever. Henry ordered the execution of the prisoners. The command rippled through the English ranks like a cold wind. For a moment, no one moved. Killing prisoners, knights, nobles, men of rank, violated every code of chivalry. Even in medieval war, this was unthinkable. But Henry's logic was brutal and clear. Survival before honor. When the order was repeated, the archers obeyed. They led the captives to the rear and began the slaughter. Some accounts describe it as methodical, others as frenzied. Swords, mallets, daggers, the same tools used to finish off wounded enemies were now turned on helpless men. The cries echoed over the field, blending with the rain. By the time the killing stopped, hundreds of French nobles lay dead in the mud, their ransom fortunes gone with them. And just as suddenly, the threat on the horizon melted away. The local French levies, seeing the devastation before them, turned and fled. There would be no rescue, no redemption, only silence. As the sun dipped low, the field grew eerily still. The English began the grim work of stripping armor and gathering what could be carried. For every man who stood, 10 lay dead or dying nearby. The French chivalry, the pride of Europe, had been broken not by numbers or superior steel, but by arrogance, mud, and the simple bow. Chroniclers later wrote that when Henry knelt in the mire to thank God for victory, tears cut through the dirt on his face. He didn't smile, he didn't cheer, because he knew what he was standing on, not triumph, but tragedy. More than 7,000 Frenchmen had fallen. The English lost perhaps a few hundred. It was not a battle, it was divine judgment rendered in mud and blood. But Agincourt was more than a victory. It was a warning that France refused to heed. 70 years earlier, at Crécy, their ancestors had made the same mistake, charging blindly into English arrows blinded by pride. And 70 years later, they did it again. For generations, the French aristocracy clung to the myth that valor and birthright could defy strategy and terrain, that courage alone could rewrite physics. But Agincourt proved that no amount of courage can save a man who refuses to learn. The echoes of that day would haunt France for decades. Entire noble families vanished from history. The chivalric age, the era of knights and banners and gallant charges, ended not in a blaze of glory, but face down in a field of mud. Henry marched on to Calais as planned, but even he could not outrun the shadow of Agincourt. Though England celebrated him as a hero, he would die young, leaving behind a legacy written in blood and rain. His son would inherit a fragile peace, and France, though humiliated, would one day rise again. Yet the lesson of Agincourt remained, not carved into monuments but into memory. A lesson about arrogance, repetition, and the price of refusing to see the past. Because on that cold October morning, the French knights did not just die in the mud, they drowned in the mistakes of their ancestors. And history, merciless as ever, simply watched it happen again. Agincourt was more than a battle, it was a mirror. It showed how easily pride can blind even the mightiest of men. How lessons written in blood are so often ignored until they must be written again. 70 years after Crécy, the same mistakes repeated, the same armored confidence, the same disregard for mud, weather, and strategy, the same belief that courage could conquer common sense. And once again, the rain fell, the arrows flew, and chivalry drowned beneath its own weight. But history never ends at one battlefield. Every generation faces its own Agincourt. Moments when hubris collides with reality. When leaders march proudly into the same traps they swore they'd never repeat. The question isn't whether they'll make the same mistakes. It's whether we'll recognize them when they do. If this story of forgotten lessons and fatal pride spoke to you, if you believe that understanding the past is the only way to stop it from repeating, then join us, subscribe, for more true stories where history exposes itself not as dusty dates and names but as living, breathing warnings. Because these moments, these echoes, they're not just history. They're us. And if you think you've seen everything history has to offer, wait until you see what it remembers next. Pause beat. I'm your channel name, and this was how French knights made the exact same fatal mistakes 70 years later and died in the mud. Thank you for watching, and remember, the past never forgets.